My name is Amelia Harlow, and I am 32 years old. 15 years ago, my father stood in the foyer of our Connecticut home, picked up my very first clay sculpture, and dropped it onto the marble floor. It shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. He looked at the mess by his leather shoes and told me art was for failures. He said I would starve without his money and his name. I packed a single duffel bag, left at 2 a.m, and erased myself from his world. Last night, I stood in the shadows of a velvet-draped opera box overlooking the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel in Manhattan. Below me, 500 of the wealthiest people in New York mingled under crystal chandeliers. I watched table number 1. My father, Charles Davenport, sat there, tugging at the collar of his tailored tuxedo. He is a senior wealth management executive, clinging to his position at a ruthless firm. He was facing forced early retirement unless he landed a whale of a client. That whale was sitting to his right, Julian Sterling. Sterling is a tech billionaire and a notorious collector of contemporary art. For 3 hours, my father poured Sterling's champagne and laughed too quickly at his jokes. Charles had spent weeks feeding Sterling a calculated lie. He claimed his firm managed the private estate of the art world's most elusive anonymous sculptor, known only as Vail. He promised Sterling an exclusive introduction. It was a bluff, built on arrogance, assuming he could throw enough money at private investigators to unmask the artist before the gala. The auctioneer stepped to the mahogany podium. Handlers wheeled out the premier lot of the evening, a towering sculpture of cast bronze and fractured tempered glass titled The Weight of Expectations. The piece was donated by Vail. Julian Sterling leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. My father leaned in close, whispering something in his ear, playing the role of the connected insider. Bidding opened at $200,000. Paddles shot up across the room. $500,000, $800,000, 1.2. My father was visibly sweating, wiping his forehead with a linen square. He knew his lie was about to be tested. Sterling did not flinch. He raised his paddle and spoke his only words of the night. 1.5. The auctioneer struck the wooden block. Sold to Julian Sterling for $1.5 million. The ballroom erupted in applause. My father stood up, patting the billionaire on the back, beaming with unearned pride. He assumed he was still in control. Then the auctioneer tapped the microphone. The room quieted. He announced that for the first time in her career, the artist had decided to reveal her identity. He gestured to the balcony and welcomed Vail to the stage. The main chandelier dimmed. A sharp spotlight cut through the dark and hit my opera box. I stood up. I wore a structured midnight blue gown and the only pair of diamond studs I had managed to keep from my late mother. I walked to the brass railing and looked down. Charles Davenport turned his head, expecting to greet a stranger he could charm and bribe. His eyes met mine. The smile died on his face. The flush of victory vanished, leaving his skin pale and hollow. He was staring at the failure he had chased away 15 years ago, the same girl who had just commanded $1.5 million. Before I tell you what happened when I walked down that grand staircase and took the microphone, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories. But only do so if this story truly resonates with you and you want to know how the night ends. Drop your age, your location, and the local time in the comments. I want to know who is listening and where you are right now. Now let me take you back 15 years to that cold foyer in Connecticut, the shattered clay on the floor, and the moment I decided to become invisible. The Davenport estate in Greenwich, Connecticut was not a home. It was a holding company. Every room was staged to project a specific tier of wealth. The floors were imported Italian marble. The walls were painted in sterile gallery white. The air always felt exactly 3 degrees too cold. My father, Charles, managed his family the same way he managed his high-yield portfolios. He assessed our value, our output, and our return on investment. If a person or an interest did not elevate the Davenport brand, They were categorized as a liability and swiftly liquidated. My older brother Harrison understood this math by the time he was 12. By 20, he was a junior clone of Charles. He wore his first tailored suits to family dinners and spoke in the clipped transactional cadence of a Wall Street veteran. Harrison was the golden child, the guaranteed return on my father's investment. I was the anomaly. I inherited my mother's eyes and, unfortunately for Charles, her temperament. My mother was a painter before she married him. She traded her canvases for country club memberships and charity luncheons. When she died of a sudden aneurysm, I was 9 years old. Charles boxed up her remaining art supplies the morning after the funeral and locked them in the attic. We never spoke of her creative life again. But you cannot legislate genetics. I found my way to art through quiet rebellion. I claimed a damp corner of our unfinished basement and turned it into my sanctuary. I bought cheap blocks of raw clay with my allowance. I learned how to build wire armatures and sculpt human forms by checking out anatomy books from the public library. I spent thousands of hours in that basement with clay under my fingernails, shaping faces and figures in the dim light. By the time I was 17, I had poured every ounce of my grief and ambition into a single piece. It was a life-size bust of my mother. I sculpted it from memory, capturing the exact slope of her jaw and the way she used to look out the window when she thought no one was watching. It was raw and unpolished, but it had a pulse. I photographed it from every angle and submitted the portfolio to the Rhode Island School of Design. The thick envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I opened it with shaking hands, standing in the grand foyer. It was an acceptance letter, accompanied by a full merit scholarship. It was an exit visa. It was undeniable proof that I had a tangible, valuable skill. In a rare moment of naive optimism, I placed the letter and the clay bust on the mahogany console table near the front door. I wanted Charles to see it when he walked in. I wanted him to look at the scholarship, the financial validation, and admit that my work had worth. I was standing near the sweeping staircase when the front door opened. Charles walked in first, handing his cashmere overcoat to the housekeeper. Harrison followed right behind him, checking his phone. Harrison saw the envelope first. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the crest of the art school. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face. He read the acceptance letter out loud, his voice dripping with aristocratic condescension. Charles froze. He turned slowly, his eyes dropping from the letter in Harrison's hand to the clay bust resting on the polished wood of the console table. He did not yell. He did not raise his voice. My father used a low, measured tone, reserved for dismantling bad corporate mergers. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and stepped toward me. He asked if I honestly believed I was going to waste 4 years playing with mud. He informed me that the deposit for the business management program at Cornell had already been paid. He told me I would learn market analysis. I would join his firm. I would contribute to the family legacy. I looked him in the eye and said, no. I told him I earned the scholarship and I was going to Providence in the fall. The silence that followed was suffocating. Harrison leaned against the doorframe, slipping his phone into his pocket, crossing his arms to watch the execution. Charles stepped up to the console table. He placed his hands on the heavy clay bust of my mother. His fingers pressed into the delicate sculpting of her cheekbones. He looked at the face I had spent 6 months shaping. He said, "Art is a hobby for the idle rich or a delusion for the poor." He told me I was neither. He said I would starve without his money and his name. Then he pushed the bust off the edge of the table. Gravity claimed it. The heavy, wet clay hit the Italian marble floor with a sickening thud. The armature wire snapped. The face broke into 50 jagged pieces, sliding across the polished stone. Dust settled around the toes of my father's expensive leather Oxfords. Harrison smirked. Charles adjusted his cuffs, stepped over the ruins of my work, and walked toward his study. He told the housekeeper to sweep up the mess before dinner. I did not scream. I did not drop to my knees and gather the broken pieces. Crying would have been a currency they could trade. On a sign of weakness, they could leverage. I just stood there, letting my heart rate slow down. The shock burned away, leaving behind a cold, pristine clarity. I looked at the shattered clay and realized Charles had not just broken my sculpture. He had severed the contract of our family. I walked upstairs to my bedroom. I did not pack a trunk. I took a single canvas duffel bag. I packed 2 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters, and a heavy coat. I opened my jewelry box and took the simple diamond stud earrings that had belonged to my mother. Then I reached under my mattress and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside was $842 in small, crumpled bills. I had earned every cent over the past 2 years by sneaking down to the harbor on weekends and drawing charcoal portraits of tourists. It was my secret emergency fund. Now it was my entire net worth. I sat on the edge of my bed and waited for the house to go dark. At 2 a.m, I opened my bedroom door. The estate was silent. I walked down the grand staircase, bypassing the foyer where the faint smear of clay still marked the marble floor. I slipped out the side door and walked down the long gravel driveway. The cold night air hit my lungs like ice. I reached the wrought iron gates and stopped. I knew if I walked through them, I could never return. If I used the Davenport name to ask for a favor, rent an apartment, or apply for a loan, Charles would find me and pull the strings. To survive, I had to cut the bloodline. I dropped the name Davenport right there on the asphalt. I took my mother's maiden name. Harlow. Amelia Harlow stepped out onto the street and began walking toward the train station. I bought a one-way ticket to New York City. I sat by the window watching the dark trees blur past the glass. I had no safety net, no credit cards, and no destination other than a city that swallowed people whole. I was empty-handed, but I was free. I needed to build a new foundation. I knew the road ahead would be brutal, but rock bottom is an excellent place to pour concrete. What Charles did not know, what no one in that house knew, was that my maternal Aunt Evelyn had been watching our family dynamic for years. Evelyn despised my father, and right before she passed away, she did something quietly and legally that would alter the trajectory of my entire life. She left a key to a very specific lock, but discovering that key meant surviving my first brutal winter in Brooklyn. My first apartment was an illegal sublet above a commercial laundromat in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. The year was 2009, and the neighborhood had not yet been sanitized by luxury developers. The air inside my room tasted like bleach and damp brick. I slept on a deflated air mattress and kept my few items of clothing in a cardboard box. The radiator was a decorative piece of rusted iron that never produced a single degree of heat. During January, I slept wearing my heavy winter coat. Survival required a very specific kind of arithmetic. I took a job at a diner on Manhattan Avenue, working the graveyard shift because the tips were slightly better and I could eat the discarded fries. Every dollar was categorized. Rent took 50%. Food took 10%. The remaining 40% went to the hardware store. I could not afford imported clay or fine carving tools. I bought industrial plaster chicken wire and salvaged scrap metal from a nearby junkyard. I built armatures out of coat hangers and sculpted with a putty knife. My hands were permanently stained gray. My knuckles bled from the cold and the sharp edges of the wire. But I was building. Every time I shaped a new form, I felt the phantom weight of my mother's shattered bust on that marble floor. It was a brutal, exhausting existence. Yet it was mine. I answered to no one. Charles Davenport could not reach me here. However, raw grit only extends your runway so far. A year into my self-imposed exile, the physical toll began to fracture my focus. I was malnourished and running out of space in the tiny loft to store my plaster figures. The reality of poverty is that it is incredibly expensive and highly distracting. I needed capital to transition from survival to actual creation. That was when the ghost of my maternal aunt intervened. Evelyn had been my mother's older sister. She was a pragmatic woman who wore sharp suits and possessed a terrifying level of intuition. Evelyn loathed my father. She saw through his tailored veneer long before anyone else did. She passed away from pancreatic cancer when I was 14. Before she died, she looked at my early sketches and told me to protect my hands. I thought she was just offering generic comfort. I was wrong. Evelyn had planned for a casualty. A week after my 18th birthday, I received a thick envelope forwarded through a post office box I had set up. It was from a boutique law firm in Lower Manhattan. The letter requested my presence to execute a dormant provision in Evelyn's estate. Charles knew nothing about it. Evelyn had explicitly structured the document so that the funds would only activate upon my 18th birthday and only if I presented myself in person, independent of my father. I sat across from a quiet attorney in a wood-paneled office on Wall Street. He handed me a cashier's check, $20,000. To a man like Charles, that amount was a rounding error, a single country club dinner. To an 18-year-old girl freezing in a Brooklyn laundromat loft, it was a tectonic shift. It was oxygen. The lawyer handed me a handwritten note along with the check. The ink was faded, but Evelyn's sharp cursive was unmistakable. The note read simply, "Build something they cannot break." I did not spend a single cent of that money on comfort. I did not buy a better mattress or a warmer coat. I viewed Evelyn's gift as seed capital. I used a portion to rent a legitimate industrial studio space in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It had concrete floors, a rolling steel door, and ventilation suitable for heavy machinery. I bought an entry-level welding rig, a reliable kiln, and professional-grade casting wax. This upgrade required a strategic pivot. If I was going to purchase materials from reputable foundries and eventually sell my work, I needed an entity. I could not use the name Amelia Harlow. My father retained a small army of corporate litigators. If a gallery owner ran a background check and Charles caught wind that his runaway daughter was sculpting in Brooklyn, he would manufacture a frivolous lawsuit just to bleed me dry. He would tie up my assets, contact my landlords, and systematically crush my operation to prove his point. He needed me to fail. I required an ironclad shield. I filed the paperwork for an anonymous limited liability company. When the clerk asked for a designated signature, I wrote down a single word: Vale. It translates to a valley or a geographic depression, a low point. It felt fitting. I was operating from the bottom of the map, forging my identity in the deepest trench I could find. From that moment, Amelia became the administrative assistant, the ghost, the shell. Vale became the architect. I taught myself how to pour molten bronze. I learned the precise temperatures required to temper glass so it would shatter inside the metal frames without disintegrating. The process was violent and hot. I accumulated burns on my forearms. I breathed in metallic dust. I channeled every ounce of anger, every memory of that sterile Greenwich estate into the heat of the torch. My sculptures grew larger, more complex, and increasingly aggressive. They were studies in tension structures that looked as though they were buckling under immense invisible pressure, but refusing to collapse. By my 23rd birthday, whispers began circulating through the underground art scene. Curators were drawn to the visceral energy of the work. They wanted to meet the artist. I refused. I established a strict protocol: no studio visits, no interviews, no photographs. This forced anonymity, initially born of fear, mutated into a brilliant marketing asset. The elite art world operates on exclusivity. The less they know, the more they desire. The mystery surrounding Vale became a currency of its own. When I was 25, I signed with a razor-sharp gallery director named Sloane. Sloane operated a high-end space in Chelsea. She was fiercely protective and operated with the precision of a military tactician. She respected my terms without question. Sloane handled the wealthy collectors, the shipping logistics, and the relentless press inquiries. I handled the torch. We made a lethal combination. By my 28th birthday, Vale was no longer an underground secret. My pieces were selling for 6 figures. They were installed in private collections in Geneva, Tokyo, and London. I purchased a sprawling penthouse studio, paying in cash. I wore designer armor when I met with Sloane, keeping my public appearance as Amelia sharp, unremarkable and strictly administrative. No one looked twice at the quiet assistant organizing invoices in the back office of the Chelsea Gallery. I had achieved the ultimate retaliation. I was succeeding in total silence. But the universe demands balance. While my trajectory pointed straight upward, the Davenport men were beginning to experience the pull of gravity. The financial sector is a predatory ecosystem. Charles had built his career on aggressive posturing and riding the coattails of legacy clients. But the market was shifting. The old guard was being replaced by a new generation of tech innovators and ruthless quantitative analysts. Charles was bleeding accounts. Harrison, now a junior vice president at the same firm, was drowning in his own manufactured reality. He had married a woman named Paige, who viewed spending as an Olympic sport. Harrison was mortgaging his future to maintain the illusion of current dominance. They were two men standing on a shrinking iceberg, unaware that the water below them was getting warm. 2 months before the Pierre Hotel Gala, Charles received an ultimatum from his board of directors. He was losing capital. His numbers were abysmal. He needed to land a generational client or face an unceremonious early retirement. He needed a savior. He set his sights on Julian Sterling. Sterling was famously indifferent to traditional wealth managers. He ignored pitch decks and golf course handshakes. The only language the billionaire truly respected was cultural dominance. He collected fine art with the same aggressive appetite he used to acquire tech startups. And Julian Sterling's singular obsession, the one artist he had spent years trying to acquire without success, was Vail. Charles Davenport did not know he was walking into a trap of his own making. He only knew he was desperate. And desperate men make catastrophic mistakes. Let us fast forward to 2 months before the auction. The financial sector operates on a strict meritocracy, masked by expensive suits and polite handshakes. For decades, Charles Davenport coasted on legacy relationships. He managed capital for established families. But the landscape shifted. The new titans of industry did not care about country club lineages. They cared about algorithmic yields and relentless growth. Charles was a relic, staring at extinction. His board of directors delivered an ultimatum during a quiet Tuesday morning review. I learned the details much later through the corporate grapevine. They gave him 60 days to secure a cornerstone account or face mandatory early retirement. In corporate translation, that meant a forced resignation with a fractured severance package. He would lose his corner office, his expense account, and most importantly, his relevance. This impending doom did not just threaten my father, it threatened the entire Davenport ecosystem. Harrison was now 35 years old. He held the title of junior vice president at the same firm, a position secured entirely through nepotism rather than raw talent. He was the golden child, the heir apparent. But being the golden child is an expensive burden when the gold is plated. Harrison had married a woman named Paige. She possessed a terrifying appetite for status. Paige treated premium department stores like a second home and viewed international vacations as basic necessities. To maintain the illusion of extreme prosperity, Harrison had leveraged himself to the breaking point. He carried multiple mortgages on a sprawling property in Connecticut. He leased luxury vehicles he could barely fuel. He was drowning in private debt. If Charles lost his executive standing, Harrison would be exposed. Without his father's protective shadow, the younger Davenport would be evaluated on his actual performance. The firm would realize he produced zero tangible value. He would be terminated within the fiscal quarter. The house of cards would collapse. They needed a savior. They needed an influx of capital so undeniable that the board of directors would be forced to keep them both enthroned. Their target was Julian Sterling. Sterling was a self-made billionaire who disrupted the global logistics industry before his 40th birthday. He was notoriously eccentric. He refused to wear ties. He conducted board meetings in plain black crewneck sweaters. He despised traditional wealth managers and viewed men like Charles as parasites dressed in cashmere. Securing Sterling's portfolio meant managing an initial transfer of $500 million. It was a career-defining account. Dozens of elite firms had pitched Sterling. He rejected them all. He ignored glossy prospectuses and standard golfing invitations. The only language the tech mogul truly respected was cultural dominance. He collected contemporary art with the same ruthless precision he used to acquire rival startups. He wanted pieces that possessed visceral energy. And Julian Sterling's singular obsession, the one creator he had spent years trying to acquire without success, was Vail. He owned famous pop art and classic canvases, but he wanted the brutal, shattered glass and cast bronze of the anonymous sculptor who refused to play by the rules of the high society market. Charles Davenport did not understand art. He viewed it the same way he viewed a luxury watch. It was merely a metric of status. But Charles understood leverage. He recognized that Sterling had a vulnerability, a desire that could not be satisfied through traditional channels. I pieced together the sequence of events through Sloan, my gallery director. Sloan was a master of gathering intelligence. She maintained an expansive network of art brokers, private dealers, and corporate consultants. According to Sloan's sources, my father orchestrated a strategic ambush. He leveraged a mutual acquaintance to secure a brief window with Sterling at an exclusive charity golf tournament in the Hamptons. Charles was desperate. He walked alongside the billionaire on the manicured green, attempting to pivot the conversation toward financial yields and risk mitigation. Sterling was bored. He politely signaled his assistant to prepare the helicopter for departure. The account was slipping through Charles' fingers. In a moment of pure, arrogant panic, Charles played a card he did not hold. He brought up the contemporary art market. He mentioned the upcoming charity gala at the Pierre Hotel. He casually dropped the name Vail. Sterling stopped walking. He turned to face the aging wealth manager. The billionaire admitted he was seeking a private introduction to the artist. Charles Davenport looked the tech mogul in the eye and delivered a calculated fabrication. He claimed his firm represented the secretive financial estate of the anonymous sculptor. He stated that his team handled the offshore accounts, the legal shielding, and the asset protection for Vail. It was a lie built on the assumption that wealth can bend reality. Charles believed that because the artist was anonymous, they must be highly motivated by money. He assumed he could simply locate Vail's representatives, flash a corporate checkbook, and buy a 10-minute meet and greet. He thought he could purchase compliance. He had spent his entire life buying people. He saw no reason why an artist would be any different. Sterling took the bait. The billionaire made a very clear proposition. He would transfer the $500 million portfolio to the Davenport firm under one non-negotiable condition. Charles had to deliver a personal VIP introduction to Vail at the upcoming Pierre Hotel charity auction. If Charles provided the artist, Sterling would provide the funds. My father agreed, shaking hands on a promise he had no way of keeping. The arrogance was staggering. He committed to delivering a ghost. Within 24 hours, the Davenport panic began. Charles and Harrison initiated a frantic campaign to uncover my identity. They deployed hundreds of thousands of dollars from their dwindling personal reserves. They hired private investigators. They contracted ruthless corporate fixers. They bribed art dealers and harassed gallery assistants, trying to find the legal entity behind the name. They hit a reinforced concrete wall. My infrastructure was bulletproof. I had spent 15 years ensuring that no paper trail connected Amelia Harlow to the bronze sculptures leaving my Brooklyn studio. My limited liability company was registered through a proxy in Delaware. My taxes were filed by an attorney bound by strict confidentiality clauses. All external communications funneled directly to Sloan. I sat in my studio, wearing heavy denim overalls covered in metal shavings, reading the daily updates from my gallery director. Sloan would send me encrypted messages detailing the frantic inquiries flooding her office from the Davenport camp. They were sending blank checks. They were issuing thinly veiled legal threats. They were demanding access to the artist, citing urgent, high-level corporate interests. Watching them flail from a distance provided a cold, distinct satisfaction. They were accustomed to a world where every door possessed a price tag. They were currently slamming their shoulders against a door that possessed no keyhole. Meanwhile, I was entirely focused on the physical work in front of me. I was putting the final touches on the piece destined for the Pierre Hotel auction. The sculpture was a sprawling, imposing structure. I used heavy cast bronze to create the illusion of a spine bending backward. Inside the metallic ribs, I placed thick slabs of tempered glass. I used a specialized thermal shock technique to shatter the glass internally, leaving the smooth outer surface intact, while the inside splintered into thousands of glittering, jagged faults. It required intense heat, precise timing, and sheer physical strength to manipulate the materials. The studio smelled of ozone and hot metal. My muscles ached from the weight of the grinding tools. I titled the piece, "The Weight of Expectations." The irony was profound. I was forging the exact object my father was utilizing as a lifeline to save his fading empire. He was banking his entire legacy on a lie involving my art. The tension was escalating rapidly. The auction was less than 3 weeks away. The private investigators were turning up empty-handed. The corporate fixers were returning the retainer fees. Charles and Harrison were running out of time, and they were running out of options. Their desperation was about to push them out of the shadows and directly into my territory. Harrison was preparing to abandon the discreet inquiries and force a physical confrontation. He was going to walk right through the front doors of Sloane's Gallery in Chelsea. He thought he was going to intimidate a receptionist. He had no idea he was scheduling an appointment with the sister he had discarded. Julian Sterling formalized the bait. The tech mogul instructed his family office to draft the transfer protocol for the $500 million portfolio. He sent a single encrypted calendar invitation to Charles Davenport. The text contained one sentence: "Looking forward to our introduction at the Pierre." Charles stared at the glowing screen on his desk. He had promised an illusion. The countdown clock initiated a silent, deafening tick. 3 weeks remained until the charity gala. Panic requires an outlet. Charles and Harrison converted their mounting terror into a scorched earth intelligence campaign. They operated under the rigid assumption that every human possessed a purchasable threshold. They contracted a boutique corporate espionage agency staffed by former federal intelligence agents. These operatives specialized in dismantling offshore shell companies and piercing corporate veils. They billed $2,000 an hour. Harrison liquidated a portion of his wife Paige's mutual funds just to cover the initial retainer. He forged her signature on the authorization forms, relying on the hope that the Sterling account would replace the stolen capital before she noticed the deficit. The investigators targeted my supply chain. They subpoenaed shipping manifests from the foundries providing my raw bronze. They monitored freight trucks departing the Chelsea Gallery. They executed cyber sweeps, attempting to breach the encrypted servers of my legal proxy in Delaware. Every single attack struck a reinforced steel barrier. I had spent a decade and a half constructing an impenetrable fortress. My foundries operated under draconian non-disclosure agreements. Any leak triggered a penalty clause that would bankrupt their operations overnight. The freight companies utilized blind drop locations, transferring crates between unmarked vehicles in warehouse districts at midnight. The Delaware proxy was legally insulated by layers of corporate shielding. My identity was a phantom locked inside a vault. My gallery director, Sloane, functioned as the guardian of that vault. She was a former corporate litigator who abandoned the courtroom for the art market. She possessed glacial composure and a ruthless instinct for protection. She viewed my anonymity not as a marketing gimmick, but as a sacred doctrine. On a rainy Tuesday morning, a courier arrived at the gallery. He handed Sloane a sealed leather portfolio. Inside sat a certified bank draft for $250,000. Attached was a note printed on heavy Davenport firm stationery. The text politely requested a 10-minute consultation with Vail regarding a highly lucrative private commission. Sloane did not call me to discuss the offer. She walked the certified draft over to a heavy-duty document shredder and fed the paper through the steel blades. She placed the shredded strips into a standard envelope and mailed them back to Charles via regular postal service. While the Davenports hemorrhaged cash attempting to purchase a revelation, I stood inside a fireproof suit in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The studio was a cavern of concrete and flying sparks. I held an oxyacetylene torch, watching the blue flames slice through dense brass framing. The heat baked the moisture out of the air. Sweat stung my eyes. I was fusing the final skeletal structures of the auction piece. The work required grueling physical exertion. The tempered glass slabs weighed 80 pounds each. I hoisted them using a mechanical chain winch, carefully locking them into the strained bronze chassis. The metal groaned under the calculated tension. The sculpture was engineered to look like it might shatter at any given second. It stood as a physical manifestation of the psychological load my father placed on everyone in his orbit. I turned off the torch and lifted my welding mask. My phone vibrated on a nearby steel workbench. It was a secure text from Sloan detailing the shredded bank draft. I read the message while wiping machine oil from my forearms. The irony hung in the studio like thick smoke. Charles Davenport was actively draining his personal wealth, trying to locate the daughter he had deemed a financial liability. He had refused to pay my art school tuition 15 years ago, claiming it was a waste of resources. Now he was burning 10 times that amount just to learn my name. He was chasing a ghost while the ghost was busy forging the instrument of his downfall. The Pierre Hotel Gala required meticulous logistical coordination. The organizers anticipated a record-breaking event. The Children's Arts Foundation managed the promotional campaign, leaning heavily on the mystery surrounding the donated centerpiece. Digital billboards across Manhattan featured obscured, high-contrast photographs of the shattered glass and bronze. The tagline promised an exclusive unveiling. The hype intoxicated the New York elite. Everyone desired proximity to the enigma. Charles felt the tightening noose. His board of directors observed his sudden erratic behavior. They noted the substantial personal withdrawals and his obsessive focus on a single charity auction. The wealth management firm demanded stability and steady returns. Charles projected chaotic desperation. His bespoke suits began to drape loosely over his thinning frame. He snapped at junior analysts. He paced his corner office during conference calls. A week before the auction, Julian Sterling's chief of staff phoned my father. The assistant requested to finalize the security protocols for the upcoming meet and greet with the artist. Charles gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning white. He lied with practiced smoothness, stating the arrangements were proceeding flawlessly and that Vail preferred spontaneous, unscripted introductions. He hung up the phone and poured a glass of neat scotch at 10 in the morning. He recognized the lie was stretching past its breaking point. Harrison watched his father crumble under the pressure. The junior vice president realized that writing checks to unseen investigators was a failing strategy. You cannot bribe a cipher. But Harrison believed you could intimidate a gatekeeper. He operated on the assumption that fear possessed a stronger exchange rate than cash. He decided to abandon the remote tactics. Harrison was going to leverage his physical presence, his expensive tailoring, and his ingrained entitlement. He looked up the address for Sloane's Gallery in Chelsea. He told his father to cancel the private investigators. He announced he was handling the situation personally. He believed he could walk into the sleek, white-walled art space, demand immediate compliance, and break whoever stood behind the reception desk. Harrison Davenport was preparing to step out of his sanitized corporate tower and march directly into the epicenter of my world. He anticipated an easy victory over a lowly administrative assistant. He had no idea he was scheduling an appointment with the sister he had discarded. The gallery space in Chelsea stood in stark contrast to the gritty industrial reality of my Brooklyn workspace. My studio smelled of ozone and hot metal. The Manhattan showroom smelled of white tea and calculated silence. Sloan designed the space to intimidate the casual observer and comfort the wealthy collector. The walls were painted a pristine matte white. The polished concrete floors absorbed the sound of footsteps. It was a sterile, elegant vacuum. I occupied the front reception desk on a Thursday afternoon. I was reviewing structural schematics on a digital tablet, preparing the final transport logistics for the upcoming charity gala. Sloan was in the back office, conducting a private call with a curator from Geneva. I wore my camouflage, a tailored charcoal blazer over a high-necked silk blouse. My hair was pulled back into a severe, tight knot at the base of my neck. I wore heavy, thick-rimmed black glasses that altered the geometry of my face. I looked like a capable, unassuming administrative assistant. That was the intended effect. Invisibility is not always about hiding in the dark. Sometimes true invisibility involves hiding in plain sight, dressed as someone society has been trained to ignore. The heavy glass front door chimed. Harrison Davenport walked into the gallery. He was 35 years old, but the stress of his failing financial facade was beginning to age him prematurely. He wore a navy pinstripe suit. The tailoring was impeccable, but the fabric strained slightly across his shoulders. He wore a Rolex Submariner on his left wrist. The watch caught the overhead track lighting, projecting a flash of synthetic wealth. I knew his wife Paige had drained 2 platinum credit cards the previous month. The watch was a heavy piece of metal anchoring a sinking ship. Harrison possessed a very specific stride. It was the walk of a man raised in country clubs and private boarding schools. He moved as if he owned the oxygen in the room. He expected the sea to part. He expected doors to open before he reached for the handle. He strode past a row of delicate minimalist canvas pieces without offering them a single glance. He was not there for art. He was there for an acquisition. He stopped in front of the reception desk. I did not look up immediately. I kept my eyes focused on the glowing screen of my tablet. I made him wait 4 seconds. It is a minor psychological tactic, but highly effective against men addicted to immediate gratification. When I finally raised my head, I kept my chin angled downward, forcing him to look at the thick black frames of my glasses rather than my eyes. He did not recognize me. 15 years had passed since the night Charles dropped my clay sculpture onto the marble floor. I was a teenager in a paint-stained shirt the last time Harrison looked at me. Now I was a composed adult, protected by a veneer of corporate indifference. More importantly, Harrison did not actually look at my face. Men like my brother only perceive hierarchy. He saw a receptionist. He saw an obstacle. He demanded to speak to the director of the gallery. He did not say hello. He did not offer his name. He simply issued a command. I kept my voice flat and polite, the auditory equivalent of a blank sheet of paper. I informed him that Sloan was engaged in an international conference call and was unavailable for unannounced walk-in appointments. Harrison scoffed. The sound was short and dripping with aristocratic disdain. He reached inside his tailored jacket and produced a leather-bound checkbook. He uncapped a heavy fountain pen. He slapped a blank corporate check onto the polished stone desk between us. The paper bore the embossed crest of the Davenport Wealth Management firm in the upper left corner. He leaned forward. He told me he needed to secure the artist Vale for a private introduction at the Pierre Hotel next Friday. He stated that the price was irrelevant. He instructed me to take the blank check to my boss and name the figure required to make the meeting happen. He expected me to gasp. He expected me to snatch the paper and run to the back office, trembling with gratitude. I looked at the piece of paper. This thin, rectangular slip represented the crumbling foundation of my father's empire. They were attempting to buy a ghost using imaginary funds. I met his gaze through my thick lenses. I spoke in a steady, unwavering tone. I told him that Vale does not accept private commissions. I explained that the artist does not participate in public events or private meet and greets. I stated that the gallery policy is firm and all inquiries must be submitted through our standard digital portal. The rejection broke his internal script. Harrison was not programmed to process the word no from someone sitting behind a desk. His posture shifted, the polished executive veneer fractured, revealing the spoiled, frantic air underneath. He pressed his palms flat against the smooth surface of the desk. The metal clasp of his Rolex clinked against the stone. He lowered his voice, attempting to weaponize his tone. He asked if I had any idea who I was dealing with. He announced his name, Harrison Davenport. He enunciated every syllable, expecting the sound of his lineage to act as a skeleton key. A slow, cold rhythm beat in my chest. He was attempting to intimidate the exact person he had spent his entire childhood mocking. The symmetry of the moment was profound. I maintained direct eye contact. I informed Mr. Davenport that his name did not alter our gallery policies. I repeated that Vail remained anonymous and entirely unavailable for his request. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Harrison lost his temper. The Davenport rage flared to the surface. He struck the concrete desk with his open hand. The loud crack echoed through the quiet, pristine gallery. He leaned in closer, his face flushed red. He threatened me. He threatened Sloan. He stated that his father controlled hundreds of millions in capital and held deep connections within the New York art syndicate. He claimed that playing hard to get was a dangerous game. He promised to blacklist the gallery and destroy the artist's career if we did not comply. He was executing Charles' exact playbook. Bully the opposition until they surrender. Crush the non-compliant. It was fascinating to watch a man drown while standing on dry land. Harrison was projecting his own impending ruin onto me. His firm was weeks away from total collapse if they did not secure Julian Sterling. He was begging for his professional life, but disguising the plea as a tactical threat. I did not flinch. I did not lean back. I did not raise my voice. I simply smiled. It was a polite, hollow customer service smile designed to offer zero comfort. I extended my right hand. I placed my index finger on the edge of the blank corporate check. I slowly, deliberately slid the paper back across the smooth desk until it touched his knuckles. I advised him to keep his capital. I told him the gallery did not require his investment. I wished him a very pleasant afternoon. The dismissal was so calm, so utterly devoid of fear, that it left him paralyzed for a fraction of a second. He was accustomed to people shrinking when he raised his voice. My stillness shattered his momentum. He snatched the check from the desk. His face burned with a volatile mixture of unspent rage and profound humiliation. He had fired his heaviest artillery, and the target had simply smiled. Harrison turned on his heel and marched toward the exit. He shoved the heavy glass door open with unnecessary force. The glass shuddered in its metal frame. He stepped out onto the Chelsea sidewalk and disappeared into the dense Manhattan foot traffic. He walked away carrying his failure back to our father. Sloan emerged from the back office a moment later. She held a ceramic cup of black coffee. She had watched the entire exchange through the frosted glass partition. She took a sip and asked if I required a moment to compose myself. I reached up and pulled the heavy glasses from my face. I set them down on the tablet. I looked at my gallery director and told her I had never felt better. The trap was now primed. Harrison would return to the corporate tower and report the failure to Charles. They would realize that money could not solve this specific equation. Their desperation would peak. They would walk into the Pierre Hotel ballroom armed with nothing but a fragile fabrication, praying they could somehow intercept the artist before Julian Sterling discovered the truth. I gathered my things and prepared to leave Manhattan. I had a sculpture to finish in Brooklyn. The charity auction was only days away. The final stage of my work required polishing the exposed bronze edges until they reflected the surrounding room like a dark mirror. I wanted Charles and Harrison to see their own terrified faces in the metal right before the auctioneer's hammer fell. The quiet encounter in the Chelsea gallery was merely a prelude. The real reckoning demanded a much larger stage. Let me step out of the narrative for a second. Have you ever held a secret so potent that keeping it locked inside your chest actually provided more comfort than screaming it from a rooftop? If you understand that specific type of quiet power, drop a comment right now. Tell me about a time you let someone underestimate you because you knew the truth would eventually speak for itself. It takes a unique discipline to hold your tongue while people craft false narratives about your life. The night before the charity gala, I sat alone inside my Brooklyn Navy Yard studio. The heavy steel rolling door was pulled shut, locking out the ambient noise of the city. The temperature inside the cavernous space was finally dropping after days of running the oxyacetylene torch. The distinct scent of hot flux, melted casting wax, and scorched carbon lingered in the air, clinging to the porous concrete walls. I sat on a dented aluminum stool, wiping thick grease from my hands with a rough canvas rag. In the center of the expansive room, resting under the stark, unforgiving glare of halogen work lights, stood my finished creation, the weight of expectations. The sculpture was a brutal, towering configuration of dark bronze and fractured tempered glass. It commanded the physical space, forcing the viewer to confront its scale. The metal framework arched backward, engineered to project a sense of impending structural failure while remaining mathematically impenetrable. The thick, translucent slabs trapped inside the ribs caught the harsh overhead lighting, refracting the beams into 1,000 jagged prisms. It was the exact opposite of the fragile, unbaked clay bust my father had destroyed 15 years prior. That piece of mud had been a naive offering, a desperate plea for validation from a teenage girl. This bronze titan was a testament to endurance. I stared at the dark metal and thought about the decade and a half of profound silence separating me from the Davenport bloodline. 15 years of missed Thanksgiving dinners, absent birthday acknowledgments, and hollow holidays. I knew precisely how Charles and Harrison had explained my sudden disappearance to their elite social circles. In the sanitized high society echo chambers of Greenwich, Connecticut, an estranged daughter is a glaring liability. They could never admit they drove me away through sheer cruelty. Instead, they would have carefully manufactured a tragic narrative. They likely whispered to their country club associates that I was inherently unpredictable or battling phantom demons. They painted me as a troubled runaway to preserve their pristine corporate facade. When I first arrived in New York, sleeping above that Greenpoint laundromat, I was consumed by rage. Anger fueled my early survival. I used it to stay awake during graveyard diner shifts and to push through blistering cold winters. But anger is a volatile, inefficient fuel source. It burns hot and eventually consumes the container holding it. Sitting in my studio on the eve of the auction, I realized the rage had evaporated long ago. What remained in its place was an Arctic, uncompromising clarity. I was not attending the Pierre Hotel event to demand a tearful apology. I was not seeking a dramatic reconciliation. I had no desire to reclaim my seat at their mahogany dining table. Charles Davenport had looked at my 17-year-old hands and declared that creation was a pursuit for the weak. He insisted I would starve without his surname shielding me from the harsh realities of the world. I was going to the ballroom to show him empirical data. I intended to demonstrate what a failure actually looked like when forged under immense pressure. I wanted him to witness the empire I had constructed using the exact tools he discarded. You do not walk onto a battlefield wearing casual attire. The upcoming gala required specific preparation. I picked up my phone and dialed my personal stylist. She was a sharp, intuitive woman, accustomed to dressing high-profile clients for ruthless environments. She asked what aesthetic I wanted to project for the evening. I told her I did not want to look like a delicate debutante, a pampered heiress, or a conventional eccentric artist. I instructed her to find a garment that functioned as structural armor. I needed something imposing, tailored, and undeniably commanding. I requested midnight blue, a color dark enough to absorb the room, but rich enough to stand apart from the standard sea of black tuxedos. She understood the assignment instantly. Within 2 hours, a courier delivered a custom Dior gown to my loft. The fabric possessed a rigid architectural weight. It featured severe angles and a sweeping silhouette that required the wearer to stand with flawless posture. I hung the dress on a heavy steel rack near the studio window. I placed my mother's simple diamond stud earrings on the table beside it. They were the only artifacts connecting me to my past and the only jewelry I planned to wear. While I sat in the quiet sanctuary of my workspace, Charles was undoubtedly pacing the hardwood floors of his Connecticut estate. The financial trap he set for himself was reaching its critical apex. He had promised Julian Sterling the impossible. The billionaire expected a private audience with Vail, a phantom entity Charles could not locate, bribe, or intimidate. My father was preparing to walk into a room filled with 500 influential peers, armed with nothing but a fraudulent guarantee. He was a man accustomed to manipulating outcomes through wealth, relying on the assumption that every problem possessed a financial solution. He was about to learn that integrity cannot be purchased on an open market. Harrison, too, would be agonizing over his impending exposure. His failed intimidation tactic at the Chelsea Gallery earlier that afternoon had severed their final, desperate lifeline. The junior vice president had attempted to wield the Davenport name like a heavy club against a receptionist, and the strike had landed on solid granite. The brothers' failure to secure compliance meant both men would attend the auction, stripped of their usual leverage. They would be forced to smile, drink expensive champagne, and pray that Sterling somehow forgot the foundational condition of their $500 million agreement. The dichotomy of our evenings was stark. They were drowning in manufactured anxiety, terrified of losing an unearned status. I was resting in the calm epicenter of a storm I had orchestrated through sheer diligence. I walked over to the bronze sculpture and ran my bare hand along the cold, smooth edge of the metal framing. It was solid. It was real. It represented thousands of hours of unseen labor, burned forearms, and relentless discipline. Tomorrow night, the velvet drape would be pulled back. The elite hierarchy of Manhattan would assess the value of my work. The auctioneer's hammer would strike the block, dictating a monetary figure. But the financial transaction was entirely secondary to the actual event. The true masterpiece was the collision course set for the center of that ballroom. I was preparing to step out of the shadows and reclaim my narrative. I turned off the harsh halogen work lights, plunging the studio into darkness. I locked the heavy steel door behind me and walked out into the cool Brooklyn night, ready to face the men who thought they broke me. The Pierre Hotel sits on Fifth Avenue, projecting an aura of untouchable prestige. I did not walk through the main revolving doors to enter the gala. Sloan had coordinated a discreet arrival, utilizing the freight elevator reserved for high-value auction items and service staff. I navigated the concrete utility corridors, bypassing the flashing cameras and the crowded red carpet. The transition from the harsh fluorescent utility of the back halls to the plush velvet of the VIP opera box felt seamless. I took my seat in the shadows. The elevated balcony provided a perfect, unencumbered vantage point over the grand ballroom. My attire functioned as intended. The midnight blue Dior gown moved with architectural precision. The fabric held its shape, dictating my posture and demanding a straight spine. It was a carapace woven from heavy silk. I fastened my mother's diamond studs into my ears. The cool metal brushed against my skin, serving as a quiet anchor to my past. I required no other adornment. Down below, 500 guests mingled under cascading crystal chandeliers. The collective hum of their conversation generated a specific frequency unique to concentrated wealth. It was the sound of strategic alliances forming and dissolving over flutes of vintage champagne. I located table number 1 immediately. It sat dead center at the very edge of the auction stage. Julian Sterling occupied the prime seat. The tech mogul wore a charcoal suit without a tie, looking deliberately underdressed in a sea of rigid formal wear. He possessed the relaxed posture of an apex predator who knows he owns the ecosystem. Sitting directly to his right was my father. Charles Davenport used to navigate these elite galas with effortless arrogance. During my childhood, he treated charity dinners as personal victory laps. He would parade my mother around the room, utilizing her quiet elegance to soften his ruthless corporate reputation. Tonight, the arrogance had vanished. It was replaced by a cloying, desperate energy that radiated from his rigid posture. Charles leaned far too close to Sterling, invading the billionaire's personal space. He poured Sterling champagne before the waitstaff could even reach the table. He laughed a fraction of a second too early at every comment the mogul made. My father looked like a court jester performing tricks for a bored and dangerous king. Across the circular table, Harrison mirrored his father's deep anxiety. My brother gripped a white cocktail napkin, tearing the paper edges into tiny, shredded strips. His eyes darted constantly toward the ballroom entrances and the VIP reception areas. He was scanning the crowd, searching for a ghost. Harrison knew their leverage depended entirely on producing the anonymous sculptor. He had failed to secure the artist at the Chelsea Gallery earlier that week. Now he was trapped in a room with a billionaire who expected a delivery. Harrison's wife Paige sat next to him, wearing a heavy sequined gown and an expression of profound boredom. She typed rapidly on her phone, oblivious to the financial guillotine suspended mere inches above her husband's neck. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, signaling the commencement of the evening. The guests filtered back to their assigned tables. The ambient noise settled into an expectant hush. I leaned forward, resting my bare forearms on the cool brass railing of the balcony. The darkness of the opera box concealed my presence while allowing me to observe every micro-expression unfolding on the main floor. The auction initiated with minor offerings. The organizers presented a private villa rental in Tuscany, a vintage diamond necklace from a European estate, a private round of golf with a retired professional athlete. The auctioneer was a tall man with a rhythmic theatrical cadence. He guided the bidding with practiced ease, reading the room and extracting capital with smooth efficiency. These early lots served as mere appetizers, designed to loosen the wallets of the attendees and establish a competitive atmosphere. $50,000 here, $80,000 there. The numbers flowed like water across the room. At table number 1, the tension thickened with every passing minute. Julian Sterling did not raise his numbered paddle for the minor lots. He stared at the stage, his focus singular and unyielding. I watched him lean over and speak directly to Charles. Even from the elevated balcony, I could read the sharp angle of Sterling's jaw and the rigid set of his shoulders. He was asking for the timetable. He was demanding the promised introduction. Charles reached into his breast pocket and retrieved a folded linen square. He dabbed the back of his neck, wiping away a sheen of nervous sweat. He offered Sterling a tight, strained smile. He spoke a few rapid words, gesturing vaguely toward the stage and the backstage corridors. He was stalling. He was weaving another fragile thread into his web of fabrications, assuring the tech mogul that the anonymous artist would materialize at the perfect moment. Harrison stopped tearing his napkin and gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white against the dark cloth. The ballroom felt like a pressure cooker, disguised as a philanthropic celebration. The waitstaff moved with synchronized precision, clearing salad plates and pouring more wine. Every clink of silverware echoed in the vast space, adding to the underlying anxiety of the Davenport men. I focused on my breathing, keeping my heart rate slow and steady. The contrast between my physical stillness and the frantic panic radiating from table number 1 was a fascinating study in physics. They were expending immense amounts of energy, trying to control a situation that had already slipped through their fingers. I was simply waiting for gravity to do the heavy lifting. Charles always taught Harrison that control was the only metric that truly mattered in life. If you controlled the capital, you controlled the narrative. They were currently discovering the fatal flaw in that rigid philosophy. You cannot control an asset you do not possess. They had leveraged their entire professional future on a phantom entity. The psychological toll of that realization was playing out in real time under the bright chandeliers. Charles adjusted his bow tie, his fingers trembling slightly. Harrison checked his luxury watch for the 4th time in 10 minutes. Time was their enemy, and the clock was ticking down to 0. The auctioneer concluded the sale of a rare imported sports car. Bringing the preliminary segment to a definitive close. A low murmur rippled through the wealthy crowd. Everyone in the room knew what came next. The promotional materials had hyped the final lot for weeks. The organizers had promised an unprecedented unveiling. The wealthy patrons shifted in their velvet seats, adjusting their posture. The casual philanthropy vanished from the room. It was replaced by an aggressive, competitive hunger. Julian Sterling sat up straight. He pushed his empty champagne flute away, signaling he was finished with the pleasantries. He looked directly at Charles and raised a single eyebrow, delivering a silent, demanding ultimatum. Charles swallowed hard. The muscles in his jaw locked. He nodded to the billionaire, pantomiming total confidence, while his eyes betrayed sheer terror. My father was a man walking onto a high wire, realizing halfway across the chasm that someone had severed the opposite end of the rope. Down on the stage, the house lights dimmed. 2 handlers stepped out from the wings, gripping the edges of a heavy velvet drape. Underneath that dark fabric sat the bronze and glass monument I had forged with my own hands. The auctioneer stepped back to the mahogany podium, taking a deep theatrical breath. The prelude was over. The main event was about to begin, and my father was preparing to place a financial wager he could not possibly cover. 10 o'clock struck. The grand chandeliers hanging above the Pierre Hotel ballroom faded into a deep amber glow before plunging the space into deliberate darkness. A single theatrical spotlight ignited, cutting through the blackness to illuminate the central mahogany podium. The master of ceremonies stepped into the beam. He adjusted his microphone with practiced elegance. The ambient chatter of 500 elite guests dissolved into a sharp, expectant hush. They knew the pinnacle of the evening had arrived. The auctioneer cleared his throat. His voice resonated with polished authority. He announced the premier lot donated in its entirety to the Children's Arts Foundation by the enigmatic creator known to the globe only as Vale. He gestured toward the center stage. 2 handlers wearing pristine white cotton gloves stepped out from the wings. They gripped the thick braided cords attached to a towering, dark velvet drape. I leaned forward in my opera box, my bare arms pressed against the cool brass railing. My pulse maintained a steady, rhythmic beat. The handlers pulled the cords. The heavy fabric cascaded to the hardwood floor. A collective intake of breath swept through the ballroom. It was an involuntary, visceral reaction from a crowd historically immune to surprise. Under the harsh, intersecting beams of 6 overhead spotlights, my creation stood unveiled. The weight of expectations dominated the stage. It was a brutal, uncompromising monolith of cast bronze and fractured tempered glass. The metal ribs arched backward, frozen in a state of permanent, agonizing tension. Inside that rigid metallic skeleton, thick slabs of glass caught the light, refracting it into thousands of jagged, brilliant faults. The piece looked simultaneously indestructible and seconds away from a catastrophic collapse. It was not polite art. It was not a decorative centerpiece designed to match a mid-century modern sofa in a Hamptons retreat. It was an indictment. At table number 1, Julian Sterling reacted instantly. The tech mogul did not applaud politely or murmur appreciative platitudes to his table mates. He stood up. He pushed his chair back with enough force that it scraped loudly against the polished floorboards. He walked 2 steps closer to the stage, ignoring standard social protocol. His eyes traced the jagged faults inside the illuminated glass. Sterling had built his billionaire empire by disrupting established, rigid systems. He understood structural integrity, and he recognized the raw defiance radiating from the sculpture. He was captivated. Beside him, Charles Davenport remained seated. My father looked physically ill. The flush of fake confidence drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He stared at the towering bronze spine, and the terrifying realization washed over him in real time. He had lied to Julian Sterling, claiming he managed the private estate of this creator. Charles possessed a superficial understanding of wealth, but he recognized true power when it loomed over him. The artwork proved that Vale was not an amateur, a starving bohemian, or a naive novice who could be bribed with a corporate check. The artist was a seasoned architect of heavy industry. Charles realized the fatal magnitude of his deception. He had promised to leash a hurricane. Harrison sat frozen across the table. The junior vice president stared at the sculpture with wide, unblinking eyes. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing above his tight silk collar. He had walked into my Chelsea gallery, attempting to intimidate the mind behind this creation. Looking at the imposing bronze monolith, he finally comprehended the profound absurdity of his previous threat. You cannot bully someone who wrestles with fire and steel for a living. The auctioneer struck his wooden gavel against the block. The sharp crack snapped the trance holding the room. He opened the bidding at $200,000. A numbered paddle shot up from the third row. A hedge fund manager claimed the opening figure. The auctioneer acknowledged the bid instantly, pivoting his gaze across the ballroom. $300,000 came from a real estate heiress seated near the east wall. $400,000 followed seconds later from a European shipping magnate. The numbers escalated with dizzying speed. This was not philanthropy. This was blood sport. The elite patrons were no longer bidding to support a charitable foundation. They were fighting to possess the brutal beauty resting on the stage. They desired proximity to the mystery. $500,000, $600,000. The bids flew across the room like rapid gunfire. I watched Julian Sterling from my vantage point. The billionaire remained standing, arms crossed over his chest. He had not raised his paddle yet. He was simply watching the frenzy, observing the lesser predators fight over the prize before the apex predator decided to strike. Charles began to hyperventilate. His chest rose and fell in quick, shallow bursts. He wiped his forehead with the linen square again, leaving a damp patch on the expensive fabric. The pressure was crushing his lungs. He needed to secure the Sterling account to save his career, his firm, and his legacy. The entire $500 million transfer hinged on his fabricated connection to the artist. If he sat motionless while strangers fought over the masterpiece, he would look impotent. He would appear entirely disconnected from the very entity he claimed to manage. He needed to project authority. He needed to prove he belonged in the inner circle holding the leash. The auctioneer called out $700,000, looking for a challenger. My father reached for his numbered paddle resting beside his untouched champagne flute. His hand shook visibly. He gripped the wooden handle with white-knuckled desperation. He did not have this kind of capital. His personal accounts were heavily depleted from hiring private investigators and corporate spies. The wealth management firm would never authorize a discretionary purchase of this magnitude without board approval. Charles was operating on pure, blind panic. He raised the paddle high into the air. The auctioneer pointed directly at table number 1. $800,000 from the gentleman in the front row. Harrison gasped audibly, reaching across the linen tablecloth to grab his father's forearm. He whispered frantically, his face twisted in horror. The younger Davenport knew the internal math of their shared ruin. He knew they were practically broke. Charles yanked his arm away, ignoring his son. My father kept his eyes glued to Sterling, praying the tech mogul would view the exorbitant bid as a gesture of profound loyalty to the artist's estate. It was a spectacular, self-inflicted wound. Charles was betting imaginary funds on a lie that was rapidly disintegrating. If no one challenged his bid, he would be legally obligated to pay nearly $1 million he did not possess. Bankruptcy would be instantaneous, public, and devastating. A thick, heavy silence descended upon the ballroom. The rapid-fire bidding stalled out. $800,000 was a staggering sum, even for this specific demographic. The hedge fund manager lowered his paddle. The shipping magnate shook his head, conceding defeat. The auctioneer leaned forward over the mahogany podium. He scanned the vast room, his eyes sweeping past the crystal centerpieces and the tailored suits. He called out, $800,000, going once. Charles exhaled a shaky, ragged breath. A single drop of sweat traced a path down his temple. He had won the momentary optics, but he was staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. His tailored suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. He called out 800,000, going twice. Harrison buried his face in his hands, unable to watch the execution. Paige stared at her father-in-law with undisguised shock, her sequined gown glittering under the ambient light. She realized the credit lines were about to freeze. I stood motionless in the opera box. The cool brass railing grounded my stance. The trap was springing shut exactly as the physics of their arrogance dictated. I watched my father confront the terrifying consequence of his own unyielding hubris. He was trapped inside a cage forged entirely by his own desperate lies. He had tried to buy relevance with empty pockets. But the auction was far from over. Julian Sterling finally uncrossed his arms. The tech billionaire reached for his own paddle, resting on the pristine tablecloth. He did not look at the auctioneer. He did not look at the stunned crowd. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the shattered glass trapped inside the bronze ribs of my sculpture. Sterling was about to rewrite the rules of the evening. The true escalation was mere seconds away. The wooden gavel hovered in the air above the mahogany podium. The auctioneer drew breath to close the sale at $800,000, sealing my father's financial doom. But the strike never landed. Julian Sterling finally moved. The tech mogul did not frantically wave his numbered wooden sign like the hedge fund managers or shipping heirs. He simply lifted the handle 3 inches off the white linen tablecloth. He did not look at the stage. He kept his gaze fixed on the fractured glass trapped inside the bronze ribs of my sculpture. $1 million. Sterling spoke the figure in a quiet, conversational tone that somehow carried across the cavernous, silent ballroom. The sheer audacity of a $200,000 increment sucked the remaining oxygen from the room. That is how apex predators hunt. They do not engage in prolonged skirmishes. They deploy overwhelming force to paralyze their prey. Sterling built his global logistics empire using this exact methodology. He identified undervalued assets, starved out the competition, and acquired the remnants for fractions of their true worth. Tonight, he was applying Silicon Valley acquisition tactics to fine art. Charles collapsed back into his velvet chair. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, ragged gasp. He had just dodged a bullet that would have shattered his personal bank accounts and liquidated his retirement portfolios. The physical relief washed over him visibly. His rigid shoulders slumped. He wiped his brow again. But the relief was a temporary mirage. A new voice fractured the silence. 1.2. The counterbid echoed from the shadowy rear perimeter of the ballroom. A venture capitalist stood near the service doors, holding his paddle high. He wore a velvet dinner jacket and possessed the reckless energy of a man gambling with other people's capital. He wanted to claim the trophy and unseat the billionaire in the front row. It was an ego play, a public challenge issued in the center of Manhattan high society. The auctioneer swiveled his attention to the back row, confirming the new astronomical figure. He praised the gentleman for his philanthropy. He stoked the competitive fire. At table number 1, the dynamic shifted violently. Harrison stopped staring at the stage and snapped his head toward his father. The younger Davenport realized the fatal flaw in their current trajectory. If the venture capitalist won the sculpture, Julian Sterling would leave the Pierre Hotel empty-handed. The billionaire would blame Charles for failing to secure the prize. The $500 million portfolio transfer, the lifeline that would save their failing wealth management firm, would evaporate instantly. But if Sterling won the bidding war, the tech mogul would immediately demand his promised reward. He would expect the private VIP introduction to the artist, the introduction Charles had fabricated. The meeting Harrison had failed to orchestrate in Chelsea. They were trapped between 2 rapidly closing steel walls. Defeat meant corporate termination. Victory meant immediate exposure as frauds. Charles realized his predicament. His trembling hand reached for his water crystal goblet, but he knocked it against his silver salad fork. The sharp clink betrayed his fracturing nerves. He looked at Sterling, silently pleading for the billionaire to outbid the rival. My father needed Sterling to win, to maintain the illusion of his high-level connections, even if that illusion possessed a terrifyingly short expiration date. Sterling remained an island of glacial calm. He did not turn around to view his challenger. He did not adjust his posture. He simply waited, letting the tension stretch until the silence became physically uncomfortable. The venture capitalist in the back row lowered his paddle, a smirk playing on his lips, believing he had bested the Titan. The auctioneer initiated the final countdown. 1,200,000 going once. Charles squeezed his eyes shut. His tailored suit was saturated with cold sweat. He mentally calculated the severance package he would receive upon his forced resignation. He imagined the humiliating conversations at his country club. Going twice. Sterling raised his hand a fraction of an inch. 1.5. The words dropped into the ballroom like heavy lead weights. The tech mogul did not add the word million. He did not need to clarify the currency. The sheer weight of the bid crushed the remaining defiance out of the room. The venture capitalist in the back row dropped his paddle and slumped against the wall, his ego thoroughly dismantled. No one countered. No one dared. The auctioneer allowed the silence to hold for 3 full seconds, respecting the magnitude of the transaction. Then he brought the wooden gavel down. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. Sold to Mr. Julian Sterling for $1.5 million. The ballroom erupted. 500 elite patrons abandoned their polite reserve and broke into thunderous applause. They celebrated the spectacle, the sheer volume of capital exchanged, and the thrill of witnessing a record-breaking sale. I remained perfectly still in the opera box. The cool brass railing dug into my forearms. The financial transaction meant nothing to me. The money would fund pediatric arts programs, which was a noble outcome, but the true victory was unfolding at the edge of the stage. Sterling stood up, buttoning his charcoal suit jacket. He looked at the shattered glass and bronze spine with genuine reverence. He had acquired the exact artifact he desired. Charles scrambled to his feet, mirroring the billionaire's movements. My father clapped his hands loudly, forcing a wide, jubilant smile onto his pale face. He patted Sterling on the shoulder, projecting the image of a trusted advisor celebrating a mutual triumph. "A magnificent acquisition, Julian," Charles spoke with oily, practiced enthusiasm. "Truly a masterstroke. The piece belongs in your collection." Sterling nodded, accepting the praise without breaking his gaze from the sculpture. "Now, Charles," he said, his voice cutting through the applause, "I believe we have a meeting scheduled. Take me to her." My father did not miss a beat. His survival instincts kicked in, overriding his terror. He nodded vigorously. "Of course, Julian, immediately. Let me just coordinate with the event staff and secure our access to the green room." Charles planned to utilize his oldest tactic. He intended to slip away from the table, locate the hotel manager, and deploy a thick stack of $100 bills. He assumed he could bribe his way into the backstage holding areas, manufacture a security delay, and stall the billionaire until he figured out a way to spin the artist's absence. He still believed the world operated on a transactional axis. He thought he could purchase an exit route. Harrison stood up beside his father, his face a mask of poorly concealed dread. Paige remained seated, refusing to participate in the charade. She recognized a sinking ship, and she was already calculating her alimony settlement. Before Charles could turn away from the table to begin his desperate bribery campaign, the audio system crackled. The auctioneer tapped the microphone. The sharp, percussive sound sliced through the dying applause, commanding the room's attention one final time. "Mr. Sterling," the auctioneer's voice echoed across the mahogany panels, "if you would please remain at your table for just a moment." Sterling paused, his brow furrowing slightly. He looked up at the podium. Charles froze mid-step, his heart slamming against his ribs. The wealth manager turned back, his mind racing through catastrophic scenarios. Did the organizers know he was lying? Was the artist refusing to see anyone? The auctioneer smiled, a genuine, wide expression that signaled a historic deviation from protocol. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is already a remarkable success for the foundation, but we have one final, unprecedented surprise." The room fell into an expectant hush. 500 faces turned toward the stage. The waitstaff stopped pouring wine. The venture capitalists ceased their networking. Everyone sensed a shift in the atmospheric pressure. For her entire career, the creator of this magnificent piece has chosen to remain entirely anonymous, letting her profound work speak for itself. The auctioneer gestured gracefully toward the heavy bronze and glass structure. But tonight, she has decided to step out of the shadows. Charles Davenport stopped breathing. His hands dropped to his sides. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse propped up in a bespoke tuxedo. Harrison gripped the back of his dining chair, his knuckles stark white. They realized the phantom they had spent weeks hunting was no longer a phantom. The artist was in the building. Their fabricated leverage was about to be exposed in front of the single most important client of their careers. Mr. Sterling, you will not need to go far to secure your introduction. The auctioneer raised his hand, pointing directly upward toward the shadowed balconies. Ladies and gentlemen, for the very first time, please direct your attention to the VIP Opera Box and welcome to the stage our guest of honor. The main chandelier dimmed entirely. The stage lights cut to black. A single, high-intensity follow spot ignited from the rear projection booth. The brilliant white beam sliced through the darkness, traversing the length of the grand ballroom. It bypassed the crystal centerpieces, the tailored suits, and the glittering gowns. The beam hit the brass railing of my balcony and illuminated my midnight blue Dior gown. Ladies and gentlemen, the auctioneer announced, his voice echoing with theatrical triumph, I present to you the artist known as Veil. I stood up. I let the light wash over me, holding my spine perfectly straight. The moment of impact had arrived. The countdown was over. I prepared to descend the staircase and introduce Charles Davenport to the architect of his ruin. The blinding white beam held me in its center. Dust motes danced inside the rigid cone of illumination. 500 faces previously tracking the auctioneer tilted upward in synchronized confusion and awe. The collective breath of Manhattan high society snagged in their throats. For a decade and a half, I operated as a phantom. I communicated through proxies, forged metal in a locked Brooklyn warehouse, and allowed rumors to construct my public persona. Now the veil burned away under 10,000 watts of theatrical lighting. I stepped forward until my velvet shoes met the edge of the opera box. The structured silk of my midnight blue gown rustled a sharp, precise sound that cut through the lingering static of the sound system. I placed my right hand on the cool brass railing. My fingers bore the faded scars of stray welding sparks and the indelible calluses earned by maneuvering 80-pound slabs of tempered glass. Those rough hands wore my mother's diamond studs, a quiet tribute to the woman who first taught me how to observe the world. The Pierre Hotel Ballroom features a sweeping grand staircase curving elegantly from the mezzanine level down to the main floor. It is an architectural feature designed for dramatic entrances. I walked toward the first marble step. I did not rush. Hurrying implies a desire to appease an audience. I dictated the tempo of the room. Every footfall felt deliberate, echoing the methodical strokes of a putty knife against raw clay. I began the descent. 15 years ago, my departure from the Davenport estate involved slipping out a side door in the dead of night, carrying a canvas duffel bag. I fled like a thief stealing my own autonomy. Tonight, I returned through the front door. The contrast was a heavy, tangible thing. I descended the sweeping curve of the stairs, keeping my spine perfectly aligned. Lifting bronze requires rigorous core stability. It demands a physical discipline that translates flawlessly into unyielding posture. I held my chin level, denying the room even a fraction of submission. As I reached the halfway point, the initial shock, paralyzing the crowd, began to thaw. Whispers ignited, rippling through the wealthy patrons like a sudden wind moving through dry wheat. They were analyzing my face, my attire, my age. The elite patrons of the Art Syndicate expected an eccentric, older visionary, or perhaps a chaotic provocateur. They did not anticipate a 32-year-old woman moving with the glacial composure of a seasoned corporate raider. I reached the final step, and my velvet heels touched the plush carpet of the main floor. The dense crowd blocking the path to the auction stage did not need to be asked to move. The guests parted organically, creating a wide, clear aisle leading directly to table number 1. The wealthy possess a primal instinct for shifting power dynamics. They sensed the epicenter of authority transferring from the mahogany podium to the woman walking down the center aisle. They stepped back, pulling their silk skirts and tailored jackets out of my trajectory. I walked the length of the aisle. The auctioneer watched my approach with a wide, practiced smile, gripping his wooden gavel. But my attention was entirely focused on the circular table situated at the foot of the stage. I saw Harrison first. My older brother stood near his chair. He had spent the entire evening scanning the ballroom exits, searching for the phantom artist he desperately needed to save his failing career. Now, the phantom was walking straight toward him. As the distance between us closed, the stage lighting caught my features, illuminating the sharp lines of my jaw and the dark-framed glasses I no longer wore. The cognitive gears inside Harrison's mind ground to a grinding halt. I watched his brain attempt to process the impossible mathematics of the moment. He recognized the tailored blazer, the tight knot of hair, and the unapologetic posture from the Chelsea Gallery. He realized the administrative assistant he had threatened just a few days prior, the woman he promised to blacklist and destroy, was the creator of the $1.5 million masterpiece towering behind him. His jaw fell slack. The aristocratic sneer he wore like a second skin evaporated. His eyes widened, dilating, with a potent mixture of horrific realization and profound humiliation. Harrison had slammed a blank corporate check onto my concrete desk, demanding I summon my boss. He had played his heaviest hand against his estranged sister, entirely unaware he was negotiating his own execution. He took a stumbling half-step backward, bumping into the linen-draped table. The luxury watch on his wrist suddenly looked like a cheap shackle. I did not break my stride. I shifted my gaze from the crumbling junior vice president to the senior partner. I locked eyes with Charles Davenport. If Harrison experienced a collapse, my father underwent a total systemic failure. Charles stood beside the tech billionaire, the man he had lied to for weeks. The wealth manager stared at my face, and the blood retreated from his skin at an alarming velocity. He resembled a wax effigy placed too close to an open flame, melting from the inside out. Charles opened his mouth. His lips moved, forming the first syllable of my name, but his vocal cords refused to engage. No sound materialized. He was trapped in a silent void. I watched his eyes dart in rapid, panicked successions. He looked at the shattered glass and bronze spine of the sculpture resting on the stage. Then he looked back at my face. He looked at Julian Sterling, who had just paid a fortune for the privilege of standing near the artwork. The disparate threads of his reality snapped together, forming a suffocating noose. 15 years ago, he pushed a clay bust off a mahogany console table, claiming art was a delusion for the weak. He told me I would starve. He erased my existence from his pristine corporate narrative. Now he stood in the premier ballroom of Manhattan, witnessing that same erased daughter command the exact fortune and reverence he was currently begging to receive. The irony was a physical weight pressing down on his chest. He was hyperventilating, his pristine tuxedo jacket rising and falling in shallow, erratic bursts. The lie he told Sterling that he managed my private estate was now exposed as a catastrophic, suicidal fabrication. He was a man caught holding a lit match inside a powder magazine. I reached the edge of the stage, stopping mere inches from their table. The proximity amplified the tension. I could smell the expensive scotch radiating from my father's pores. I could hear Harrison's ragged breathing. Julian Sterling broke the localized paralysis. The tech mogul remained entirely unbothered by the sudden erratic behavior of his wealth managers. He operated on a different frequency. Sterling stepped around Charles, ignoring the hyperventilating executive entirely. The billionaire approached me with genuine, unbridled enthusiasm. He possessed the rare confidence of a man who never needs to check the temperature of a room because he sets the thermostat. He smiled warmly, the lines around his eyes crinkling with genuine delight. He extended his right hand across the narrow gap separating us. "It is a profound honor, young Lady Sterling," spoke his voice carrying a rich, resonant timbre that cut through the lingering whispers of the crowd. "Your work possesses a rare, uncompromising truth." I raised my right hand and met his grasp. I shook his hand with firm, deliberate pressure. The billionaire likely expected the soft, manicured grip of a sheltered creative. Instead, he met the calloused, rough texture of a bronze worker. His smile widened slightly, registering the physical evidence of my labor. He respected grit. "The honor is mine, Mr. Sterling," I replied, matching his conversational tone, projecting my voice clearly enough for the front rows to hear. "I appreciate your investment in the foundation. The children will benefit greatly from your competitive spirit." Sterling chuckled, a low, appreciative sound. He released my hand and gestured toward the towering sculpture behind me. "I have spent 3 years attempting to acquire a Vail original. I was beginning to suspect you were an industry myth." I kept my posture rigid, turning my head just a fraction of an inch to my left. I shifted my focus away from the smiling billionaire and settled my gaze directly onto the pale, trembling face of Charles Davenport. My father looked as though he might collapse onto the Pierre Hotel carpet. He was praying for an exit, for a sudden power failure, for the floor to simply open and swallow him whole. I offered the tech mogul a calm, razor-sharp smile. "I am very real, Mr. Sterling," I stated, my voice smooth and lethal, "though I believe you already know my father." The auctioneer descended the short wooden steps. He extended his hand, offering the wireless microphone. The cylinder felt cool and heavy against my palm. I gripped the smooth metal. For 15 years, my voice existed only through the proxy of my artwork. My sculptures screamed, so I could remain silent. Tonight, the parameters shifted. I raised the microphone. The subtle electronic hum of the audio system vibrated through the speakers, echoing across the cavernous space. I did not look at Charles immediately. I cast my gaze over the expansive ballroom. 500 guests sat in rapt attention. These were the titans of Manhattan finance, real estate, and industry. They were the exact demographic my father spent his entire adult life cultivating. He viewed these people as his peers, his judges, and his ultimate benchmark for success. To be exiled from this specific room was his greatest underlying terror. I held their undivided focus. "Good evening." I spoke the 2 words clearly. The sound system captured the steady, unhurried cadence of my voice, pushing it into every shadowed corner of the Pierre Hotel. "My legal name is Amelia Harlow." I paused, letting the surname hang in the air for a fraction of a second. "But I was born Amelia Davenport." The reaction was instantaneous. A low, synchronized murmur rippled through the front tables. Heads pivoted. Diamonds caught the light as wealthy patrons turned to look at table number 1. The Davenport name carried specific weight in this sector. Charles had built a lucrative wealth management firm, marketing himself as a pillar of traditional stability. A patriarch, a man who managed his lineage with the same flawless precision he applied to high-yield bonds. A discarded runaway daughter did not fit the glossy corporate brochure. The elite possess a predatory instinct for scandal. They smelled blood in the water. "The art market knows me as Vail," I continued. The murmur silenced instantly. The confirmation of my identity anchored the room. I shifted my posture, turning my shoulders directly toward the front table. I locked eyes with my father. He sat frozen, the tailored tuxedo draped over a man who had suddenly aged a decade in 60 seconds. His skin held the pale, sickly hue of old parchment. He was physically diminishing, sinking into the plush velvet upholstery of his chair. He was trapped. The social contract of the high society gala bound his hands. If he stood up and shouted, he would appear unhinged, validating my presence. If he remained silent, he absorbed the guilt. He chose the paralysis of a cornered animal. 15 years ago, I stood in the foyer of an estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. I kept my tone conversational, stripping the memory of any lingering emotional static. I held a letter of acceptance to a prestigious design school. I had sculpted a life-sized portrait of my late mother out of raw, untreated clay to secure my scholarship. I watched Harrison flinch. My brother dropped his gaze, staring down at the pristine white tablecloth. He remembered the night. He remembered leaning against the doorframe, smirking while the execution took place. Now, the junior vice president looked physically ill. His wife Paige shifted her chair a few inches away from him, creating a deliberate physical boundary. She was already calculating the collateral damage to her own social standing. My father walked into that foyer. I kept my eyes fixed on Charles. He picked up my sculpture. He told me that creation was a pursuit for the weak. He informed me that art was a delusion reserved for failures. He promised I would starve without the protection of his money and his surname. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning units. The guests stared at Charles. The judgment of his peers was immediate and severe. Julian Sterling stood a few feet away watching the scene unfold with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. The tech mogul despised inherited arrogance. He built his empire from a garage. Hearing a wealth manager mock the concept of building something from scratch offended Sterling's core philosophy. Then my father dropped the bust onto the marble floor. I let the words land with the heavy finality of a gavel strike. It shattered into 50 pieces. He told the housekeeper to sweep up the mess. Charles opened his mouth. A faint, breathless sound escaped his throat, but no actual words materialized. His defensive reflexes were short-circuiting. He had spent weeks assuring Julian Sterling that he personally managed the offshore accounts and legal shielding for the anonymous artist. He had leveraged his entire firm on that fabricated relationship. My simple, factual narrative was currently dismantling his lie, brick by brick, in front of the very billionaire he intended to deceive. I left the estate at 2 a.m. I carried a single canvas duffel bag and $800 in cash. I did not take a coat. I did not look back. I bought a one-way train ticket to Brooklyn. I raised my free hand, gesturing toward the towering bronze and glass structure resting on the stage behind me. The stage lights caught the fractured geometric patterns inside the thick, tempered slabs. I spent the next 15 years learning the specific arithmetic of survival. I rented an illegal, unheated loft above a commercial laundromat. I worked graveyard shifts pouring coffee. I saved my tips to purchase industrial plaster and salvaged scrap metal. I learned how to ignite an oxyacetylene torch. I learned the precise temperatures required to melt raw brass. I learned how to trap shattered glass inside a rigid metal spine so it fractures but refuses to break under pressure. I looked at the crowd again. I wanted the 500 investors, executives, and heirs to understand the vast, unbridgeable canyon separating their reality from mine. They traded invisible numbers on glowing screens. I wrestled with fire and gravity. I stand here tonight to confirm that Charles Davenport was correct about one specific detail. I lowered the microphone a fraction of an inch, stepping to the very edge of the stage. The proximity forced my father to look up at me. It requires a profound failure to understand the fundamental mechanics of rebuilding. You cannot forge reinforced steel unless you are willing to burn away the impurities. I delivered the final sentence directly to the man who thought he erased me. Dad, thank you for shattering my clay. It taught me how to cast in bronze. I did not drop the microphone. Dropping it is a theatrical gesture, an emotional release. I did not require a release. I possessed total equilibrium. I turned to my right and calmly handed the smooth metal cylinder back to the master of ceremonies. He took it with a stunned, trembling hand. I did not yell. I did not shed a single tear. I offered no dramatic exit. I simply let the dead, suffocating silence wrap around table number 1 like a heavy woolen blanket. I walked away from the podium, moving toward the service exit at the rear of the stage. The transaction was complete. The boundary was set. But the fallout in the ballroom was only just beginning. As my velvet heels clicked against the hardwood floor, I heard the unmistakable sound of Julian Sterling clearing his throat. The tech billionaire had paid $1.5 million for a masterpiece. Now he was turning his attention to the fraudulent wealth manager who had attempted to broker a phantom deal. The trap I constructed was flawless, but Sterling was about to pull the lever. Charles Davenport was about to experience a professional execution. I reached the heavy velvet curtains at the edge of the stage. Instead of exiting immediately into the quiet concrete service corridors, I paused in the shadows. I turned my body slightly to observe the main floor. The suffocating silence I left behind finally shattered. 500 guests erupted into applause. It was not the polite, refined clapping typical of standard charity galas. It was a raucous, sustained ovation. The Manhattan elite adore a grand spectacle, especially one that dismantles a peer in real time. They were applauding the art, but they were also cheering for the precise execution they just witnessed. Julian Sterling did not clap. The tech mogul remained standing at table number 1, his posture rigid and commanding. Sterling constructed his global logistics empire by identifying systemic inefficiencies and cutting them out with surgical precision. He abhorred fabricated data. He detested men who inflated their own value to secure unearned dividends. He had spent 3 weeks listening to Charles Davenport claim intimate professional ties to the anonymous sculptor. Charles had promised a seamless introduction to his exclusive, high-value client. Now the billionaire understood the profound depth of the deception. The wealth manager did not represent the artist. He had discarded her 15 years prior. Sterling turned his body toward my father. The ambient noise in the ballroom was deafening, but the space between the two men seemed sealed inside a pressurized vacuum. Charles tried to stand upright. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the edge of the linen-draped table for physical support. His bespoke tuxedo jacket hung loosely over his slumped shoulders. He looked up at the billionaire, attempting to stretch a reassuring, confident smile across his pale face. The smile failed. It resembled a painful grimace. "You informed me you managed her private estate, Charles." Sterling's voice was level, devoid of any theatrical elevation. He did not need to shout to inflict staggering damage. "You stated your firm handled her offshore accounts and legal shielding. You sat on the golf course in Southampton and looked me in the eye, assuring me you were close." Charles swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed against his tight silk collar. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, a desperate attempt to regain equilibrium in a free-falling elevator. "Julian, please, you must understand. It is a highly complex family misunderstanding. Amelia has always been theatrical. She is prone to exaggerations and emotional outbursts. We prefer to keep these domestic disputes private to protect her reputation." The excuse was pathetic. It was the reflex of a man accustomed to gaslighting his subordinates. Sterling did not blink. He slowly turned his head to view the towering bronze and shattered glass structure resting on the illuminated auction block. He studied the heavy metal ribs and the calculated tension holding the geometric fragments together. He absorbed the undeniable physical evidence of my labor and discipline. Then he shifted his cold gaze back to the trembling executive. "She is a genius." Sterling delivered the verdict with chilling clarity. "And you are a fraud." The tech mogul reached into the interior pocket of his charcoal jacket. He retrieved his cell phone. He did not break eye contact with my father as he tapped the screen. Sterling addressed his chief of staff, who was standing a few feet away near the VIP perimeter, monitoring the exchange. "Cancel the portfolio transfer," Sterling issued the directive. "Halt all current negotiations with the Davenport firm. We do not proceed." The words functioned as a guillotine blade dropping onto the mahogany table. Charles released a choked, breathless sound. The $500 million account represented his sole lifeline. It was the only shield protecting him from the impending board of directors mandate. Without the sterling capital, his forced early retirement was guaranteed. His legacy was erased in a 10-second exchange. He was staring at total corporate exile. "Julian, wait." Charles reached out his hand, trembling uncontrollably. "Wait, no. We have signed preliminary disclosures. We can rectify this. I can offer a reduced management fee. I can restructure the terms to favor your holding company." Sterling stepped back, avoiding the physical contact. "I do not restructure terms with liars, Charles." The billionaire adjusted his cuffs, his face a mask of uncompromising disdain. "Furthermore, I refuse to do business with men who break their own children to feed their fragile egos. Enjoy the rest of the gala." The tech mogul turned his back on table number 1. He walked up the short wooden stairs to the stage, approaching the auctioneer to finalize his acquisition of my sculpture. He dismissed Charles from his reality entirely. Harrison collapsed back into his velvet chair. The junior vice president stared at the ornate ceiling, his mouth hanging open in silent shock. He had forged his wife's signature on mutual fund withdrawals to hire corporate spies. He had drained his personal accounts, attempting to locate a phantom. Now the promised windfall was gone. His own termination from the firm would follow his father's departure within weeks. The nepotism shield was shattered, leaving him exposed to the harsh meritocracy he had always avoided. Paige Davenport did not offer her husband a single word of comfort. She picked up her crystal clutch, stood up from the table, and walked toward the exit without looking back. She recognized a doomed ecosystem. She was securing her own survival, calculating the fastest route to a lucrative divorce settlement. The surrounding elite patrons observed the interaction with predatory fascination. The upper echelons of society operate on a ruthless current of self-preservation. They smelled the sudden, undeniable stench of professional ruin radiating from the Davenport men. Guests seated at adjacent tables subtly shifted their chairs, turning their backs to Charles and Harrison. No one approached them to offer sympathy. No one raised a glass in their direction. The room enacted a swift, silent quarantine. They became instant pariahs, isolated in the center of a crowded ballroom. I watched the isolation take hold from my vantage point in the shadows. I had not drafted a single cease and desist letter. I had not initiated a defamation lawsuit. I had not hired a team of ruthless litigators to drain their resources. I simply forged a piece of metal, stood under a spotlight, and spoke a factual sequence of events. The truth requires no embellishment when deployed at the precise structural weak point. I let their own manufactured arrogance trigger their collapse. They built a house of cards and handed me the fan. The objective was achieved. I turned away from the velvet curtains. I navigated the quiet concrete corridors behind the grand ballroom, moving toward the private service exit. I wanted to breathe the cool, uncirculated air of the Manhattan streets. I wanted to return to my Brooklyn studio and feel the familiar rough texture of my tools. The Pierre Hotel held nothing else for me. I pushed the heavy metal security door open, stepping out into the crisp autumn night. The sudden drop in temperature felt grounding against my heated skin. A sleek black town car sat idling near the curb. Sloan had arranged the transportation, ensuring a seamless departure from the venue. I walked toward the waiting vehicle, ready to leave the gala and the Davenport legacy behind me forever. But panic is a powerful, unpredictable catalyst. Desperate men rarely accept defeat gracefully. They flail, attempting to drag whoever they can reach down into the sinking water with them. As I reached for the polished handle of the car door, I heard the distinct, frantic sound of leather dress shoes sprinting across the pavement. I heard my father shouting my name, his voice cracking with unhinged rage. The professional execution inside the ballroom was finished, but the personal confrontation was sprinting directly toward me. The heavy metal security door of the Pierre Hotel slammed against the exterior brick wall. The sharp, metallic clang fractured the quiet hum of the Manhattan street. I stood 3 feet away from the idling black town car, my hand resting lightly on the chrome door handle. The autumn air was sharp, biting into the exposed skin of my shoulders, but I welcomed the cold. It cleared the residual stifling heat of the ballroom from my lungs. "Amelia, stop right there!" The command echoed across the pavement. It was the exact tone Charles Davenport used to direct his subordinates and dismiss his children. A harsh, guttural bark designed to demand immediate compliance. 15 years ago, that voice sent ice rushing through my veins. Tonight, it sounded thin, brittle, and entirely devoid of authority. I turned slowly. The silk of my midnight blue gown swept across the concrete. My father and my older brother sprinted out from the service corridor. They looked nothing like the polished titans of industry who had posed for photographs just 2 hours earlier. The transformation was startling. Charles had ripped his silk bow tie from his collar, leaving it dangling like a severed cord. His bespoke tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, flapping open to reveal a sweat-stained dress shirt. His face was a mask of unhinged panic, flushed deep crimson under the amber glow of the street lamps. Harrison flanked him, matching his frantic pace. The junior vice president was panting, his chest heaving as he stopped a few yards away. His pristine corporate facade had dissolved into sheer, undisguised terror. "Do you possess any idea what you just did?" Charles hissed, closing the distance between us. He pointed a trembling finger toward my face. He wanted to close the gap, to use his physical presence to intimidate me, but an invisible barrier kept him at bay. He recognized on some primal level that he was no longer dealing with a frightened teenager. "You ruined me. You cost this family a $500 million portfolio." Sterling walked away. "My board of directors will demand my resignation by Monday morning. My legacy is erased." He spat the words, relying on his oldest weapon, guilt. He expected me to flinch. He expected me to absorb the blame for the catastrophic collapse of his empire. For 18 years, I watched him utilize this exact tactic. Whenever a volatile investment failed or a lucrative deal collapsed, he systematically transferred the fault onto his junior partners, his assistants, or his wife. Charles never absorbed a loss. He always deflected. I looked at his trembling finger. I did not raise my voice to compete with the ambient noise of the city traffic. I spoke with a quiet, measured cadence that forced him to stop shouting just to hear me. "I did not ruin your career, Charles," I stated, dissecting his frantic logic with surgical precision. "I did not march into the ballroom and steal your cornerstone client. You walked onto a golf course in Southampton and delivered a calculated lie to a billionaire. You told Julian Sterling you managed the private estate of an artist you had not seen in a decade and a half. You built a fragile bridge out of imaginary leverage and expected it to hold a freight train." He shook his head, refusing to accept the mirror I held up to his actions. "You orchestrated this entire spectacle to humiliate me. You plotted this ambush." I offered a brief, hollow laugh. The sound hung in the crisp air. The supreme arrogance required to believe that delusion is staggering. I did not spend thousands of hours casting bronze and shattering glass to exact revenge upon a wealth manager from Connecticut. I created a masterpiece. The charity organizers requested my presence. I simply walked down a staircase and introduced myself. The fact that my basic introduction triggered your professional termination is not a conspiracy. It is merely the consequence of your own staggering hubris. Harrison stepped forward, inserting himself into the confrontation. The younger Davenport recognized that his father's strategy of rage was failing. Intimidation was a useless currency. Harrison decided to pivot, attempting a rapid tactical maneuver. He smoothed his lapels, attempting to project a calm, reasonable demeanor. It was a pathetic imitation of diplomacy from a man staring into an abyss. Amelia let us take a breath. Harrison spoke, holding his hands up, palms facing outward, in a gesture of false surrender. "Dad is upset. We are all operating under high stress, but we are rational adults. More importantly, we share blood. We are family. I studied my brother. During our childhood, Harrison treated me as a convenient target for his boredom. He mocked my paint-stained clothes. He locked the basement door when I was working. He smirked when Charles threw my clay bust onto the marble foyer. He had never once intervened on my behalf. Now, facing his own financial ruin, he dared to invoke the concept of kinship. There is a path forward here. Harrison continued, his voice dropping into the smooth, persuasive register he used to pitch hesitant investors. Sterling canceled the transfer, but the wealth management firm still possesses vast resources. You are holding a unique position in the art syndicate right now. Your profile has never been higher. We can synergize. You introduce us to your elite gallery patrons, your high net worth collectors. We provide the financial backing to scale your studio operations. We can rebuild this dynamic together. The proposition was so profoundly absurd, it bordered on tragic. Harrison was attempting to leech off my newfound status to save his sinking ship. He wanted to monetize the sister he had discarded. He wanted to leverage my reputation to replace the income his wife Paige was currently preparing to strip away in divorce court. I looked at my brother and dismantled his final illusion. You have no financial backing, Harrison. I spoke the truth flatly, stripping away the corporate jargon. You are drowning in private debt. You forged your wife's signature to hire private investigators who failed to find me. Your position at the firm will evaporate the second your father hands in his forced resignation. You are bankrupt in every conceivable metric. I do not require your synergy. I am the sole architect of my empire. Charles let out a low, guttural sound of defeat. His shoulders slumped forward. The remaining fight drained out of his posture, leaving a hollow, aging man standing on the cold pavement. He realized the transactional nature of his entire life had finally yielded a zero return. He possessed nothing he could offer me. He possessed nothing I feared. I opened my small, structured clutch. I reached inside and retrieved a sleek, matte black business card. The card bore no logo, no artistic flourish, and no personal contact information. It contained a single phone number and the name of a formidable corporate litigation firm headquartered in Manhattan. I extended my arm, holding the stiff card between my index and middle fingers. Harrison hesitated, then reached out and took it. That is the direct line to my legal counsel, I instructed my tone, carrying the finality of a gavel strike. If either of you ever approach me again, if you attempt to contact my gallery director, Sloan, if you solicit my patrons or use the name Vale in any future business dealings, my attorneys will file an immediate restraining order. They will follow that with a harassment lawsuit designed to drain whatever minimal capital you possess after your firm severs your contracts. Charles stared at the black card in his son's hand. His eyes were wide, unblinking. You threw me out of your house when I was 17 years old. I delivered the closing statement directly to my father, holding his fractured gaze. Tonight, I am returning the favor. Do not follow me. I turned away from the Davenport men. I pulled the heavy chrome handle of the town car, opening the door. I stepped into the warm, quiet interior of the vehicle. The leather seats offered immediate comfort. I pulled the door shut, pulling the secure physical boundary into place. The heavy glass muffled the sounds of the chaotic Manhattan street. I looked through the tinted window. Charles and Harrison stood frozen on the sidewalk. They were isolated under the street lamp, two remnants of a collapsing dynasty holding a worthless business card. They looked small. The sprawling shadows they used to cast over my childhood had vanished entirely, replaced by the cold reality of their own irrelevance. I nodded to the driver. The engine purred a low, steady vibration. The town car pulled away from the curb, merging smoothly into the northbound traffic. I leaned back, closing my eyes for a fraction of a second. The confrontation was finished. The raw materials of my past had been melted down, refined, and recast into something unbreakable. I was leaving the Pierre Hotel, and I was never looking back. If you assume the narrative concluded on that cold Manhattan pavement, you do not understand the unforgiving mechanics of corporate America. High finance operates with the predatory efficiency of a shark sensing a wound. The ecosystem demands constant growth, and it punishes weakness with swift, clinical precision. Charles Davenport had built his entire identity around the illusion of unassailable leverage. Once Julian Sterling exposed that leverage as a hollow fabrication, the foundation of my father's career disintegrated. Charles arrived at his firm early Monday morning. He wore a fresh charcoal suit, attempting to project his usual impenetrable authority. He strode past the reception desk, ignoring the junior analysts who suddenly found reasons to look away as he passed. He rode the private executive elevator to the penthouse floor, rehearsing a speech about market fluctuations and long-term strategic pivots. He planned to frame the Pierre Hotel disaster as a minor miscommunication. He never delivered that speech. The chairman of the board, alongside the head of human resources, was waiting inside his corner office. They did not offer a handshake. They did not invite him to sit down. The chairman simply slid a thin manila folder across the polished mahogany desk. Julian Sterling had not merely canceled the $500 million portfolio transfer. The tech mogul had utilized his extensive professional network to casually mention the Davenport deception to several key venture capitalists. Word spread through the elite investor class over the weekend. By Monday morning, the reputational damage was terminal. The board of directors held an emergency vote on Sunday night. They handed Charles a forced early retirement package. The terms were draconian. He would receive a fraction of his anticipated pension in exchange for signing an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. If he contested the termination, they threatened to pursue legal action for gross negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. His legacy was erased in a 4-minute conversation. Security personnel stood by the elevator, waiting to escort him out of the glass tower. He packed a single cardboard box with his personal desk items and walked out into the financial district, a ghost in a tailored suit. Harrison believed he could outrun the blast radius. My older brother spent the next 3 days attempting to distance himself from his father's sudden exile. He scheduled aggressive lunch meetings with senior partners, hoping to prove his independent worth. He pitched new acquisition strategies using aggressive corporate jargon. The partners listened politely, but the verdict was already sealed. Nepotism only functions when the benefactor retains power. Without Charles casting a protective shadow, Harrison was finally evaluated on his raw metrics. His numbers were glaringly deficient. He produced zero tangible value for the firm. On Thursday afternoon, Human Resources summoned the junior vice president. They informed Harrison his position was being eliminated due to corporate restructuring. They offered him 2 weeks of severance pay. He surrendered his company phone and his access badge. When Harrison walked out of the building, he activated his personal cell phone. A digital notification waited on the screen. It was an email from a prominent family law attorney. His wife, Paige, had officially filed for divorce. She cited irreconcilable differences. Paige possessed a ruthless survival instinct. She recognized the financial well had run dry, and she initiated the asset division process before Harrison could even process his termination. Within a month, he would be liquidating his luxury watch and vacating the Greenwich estate just to cover his mounting legal fees. I did not witness any of this fallout firsthand. I did not monitor the financial news networks or search their names on digital business forums. Sloan, my gallery director, functioned as my filter. She forwarded the pertinent headlines to my secure tablet. Wealth management executive ousted following charity gala fiasco. I read the brief articles, swiped the notifications away, and picked up my welding torch. The contrast between their chaotic ruin and my grounded reality was profound. My Brooklyn workspace feels expansive. Floor-to-ceiling industrial windows line the eastern wall, allowing natural sunlight to pour over the raw steel and concrete. I upgraded the ventilation systems and hired 3 dedicated apprentices to assist with the heavy metal casting. The demand for Vallée sculptures tripled following the auction. The Manhattan elite who witnessed the confrontation firsthand clamored to acquire my work. They desired the physical manifestation of the defiance I displayed on that stage. Sloan managed the influx of elite clients with flawless precision, enforcing waiting lists and demanding exorbitant premiums. We dictated the terms of every single transaction. I no longer wear the dark, thick-rimmed glasses or the severe administrative blazers. When I visit the Chelsea Gallery, I arrive as the architect of the brand. I wear practical, comfortable clothing. I speak directly with curators and museum directors. The camouflage is obsolete. On my primary drafting table, situated between digital calipers and protective safety goggles, rests a small, jagged object. It is a piece of dried, untreated clay. It is the only surviving fragment of the bust Charles dropped 15 years ago. I salvaged it from the foyer floor before I packed my duffel bag and vanished into the night. I keep the shard on my desk not out of nostalgia or lingering grief. It serves as a definitive metric. It is a stark physical reminder of the raw material I started with. Families like the Davenports operate on a specific volatile currency. They trade in engineered silence, enforced compliance, and the constant underlying threat of financial ruin. They condition you to believe that your worth is tethered to their approval. They demand you shrink yourself to fit inside their pristine, hollow narratives. But you cannot define your own value using the scales of people who only know how to destroy. The moment you stop fearing their leverage, they lose their grip entirely. They cease to be intimidating titans and become ordinary, fragile people, standing on a cold pavement holding a worthless piece of cardboard. Charles told me art was a delusion. He stated I would starve without his surname. He was projecting his own greatest fear onto me. He was terrified of existing in a world without his corporate title. When they stripped his title away, he had nothing left. When he stripped my security away, I discovered I possessed an entire forge inside my chest. I built an empire out of the exact debris my father discarded. I took the shattered pieces, the rejection, and the cold nights in Greenpoint, and I cast them into reinforced bronze. If you are listening to this and you reside in a house that feels like a holding company, if you have people in your life who view your dreams as liabilities, if you have ever watched someone attempt to break your spirit just to feed their own fragile ego, I want you to look at the fragments they left behind. Those broken pieces are not garbage. They are raw materials. You possess the capacity to build something they cannot comprehend. You have the strength to walk out the side door and forge a new identity. The process will demand grueling labor. The heat will scorch you. The early years will test your endurance in ways you cannot currently imagine. But the foundation you pour with your own hands will never crumble under the weight of someone else's expectations. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you have ever taken the broken pieces of your life and forged them into structural armor, please hit the subscribe button. Tap the notification bell to hear more stories of resilience. Drop a comment below and tell me about the moment you decided to stop seeking validation from people who refused to see your worth. I read every single response. Your experiences fuel this community. Remember, you are not defined by the clay they shattered. You are defined by the metal you pour. Keep building. You are a masterpiece. Although the painful echo of a father shattering a young girl's clay sculpture onto a cold marble floor might initially seem like the definitive end of her artistic dreams and a cruel mandate to conform to the sterile, transactional expectations of a ruthless corporate high society that values nepotism over genuine talent, it is ultimately through the grueling, silent alchemy of surviving in a freezing Brooklyn loft and transforming that profound rejection into the raw fuel needed to cast unbreakable bronze and tempered glass that true power is forged, demonstrating to anyone who has ever been belittled, discarded, or told they would starve without the conditional safety net of a toxic family name, that your intrinsic worth is never determined by those who blindly worship status, but rather by the resilient, undeniable empire you build with your own calloused hands. a profound and satisfying reality brilliantly illuminated when a supposedly worthless, discarded daughter steps out of the blinding shadows to command $1.5 million masterpiece, exposing her oppressor's fabricated leverage and watching their fragile house of cards collapse under the inescapable weight of its own devastating hubris, which serves as the ultimate reminder that you are the sole architect of your destiny, and that the shattered fragments of your past are merely the raw materials for your masterpiece. So if you are finally ready to stop shrinking your vibrant potential to fit comfortably into someone else's exceedingly hollow narrative, and instead want to embrace the magnificent metal you can pour from your own broken clay, please hit the like button, subscribe to Sophia Told Stories for more empowering journeys of triumphant reclamation, and share your own story in the comments below to join a community of survivors who know that true value is never inherited, but fiercely and